The excuse of an extended lunch break was all I needed to escape the suffocating fumes of the neighborhood salon. I stepped out onto the damp Seattle pavement, pulling my thin jacket against my chest. The persistent rain was a familiar companion as I navigated the crowded streets. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, fueled by a mixture of terror and anticipation. I was walking a fragile tightrope, leaving my dull reality behind to chase a forbidden sun. The towering glass and steel skyscraper loomed ahead, looking like an impenetrable fortress reaching into the clouds. I paused on the wet sidewalk, staring up at the monumental structure that housed thousands of ambitious souls. My worn sneakers felt out of place on the polished marble steps leading to the entrance. Taking a deep breath of the heavy city air, I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped into a different universe. I was crossing an invisible boundary into a world where my husband was nothing but an insignificant speck. The moment I entered the corporate lobby, the blast of industrial air conditioning hit my skin like a physical blow. My damp clothes clung to my chilled body, a stark reminder of the stormy street I had just left. Men and women in tailored suits rushed past me, their sharp footsteps echoing loudly on the stone floor. I felt incredibly small and exposed, a fragile ghost out of her depth in this temple of wealth. I wrapped my arms around my waist, trying to preserve my meager body heat against the sterile cold. I approached the bank of private elevators with my head slightly bowed, trying desperately to avoid drawing unwanted attention. The sleek doors slid open with a soft chime, inviting me into a pristine cabin made of glass and steel. I stepped inside the empty space, watching the doors glide shut and sever my connection to the chaotic lobby. The machine began its smooth ascent, pulling my stomach downward as the ground floor faded from view. Through the transparent walls, the sprawling gray city slowly began to shrink beneath my trembling feet. As the digital indicator climbed higher, we passed the sprawling level that housed the logistics department. My breath caught in my tight throat, knowing Roger was somewhere on that floor, sweating through his starched uniform. He was likely hunched over a crowded desk, terrified of making a mistake and losing his precious paycheck. He believed he was the master of my life, unaware that I was ascending past him to meet the creator of his universe. A sudden rush of invisible power warmed my chilled blood, replacing my fear with quiet strength. The rapid ascent finally began to slow, the glass cabin gently decelerating as it approached the summit of the skyscraper. The doors slid open to reveal the executive penthouse, a breathtaking reception area that smelled faintly of rich espresso. The intimidating silence up here was thick, a sharp contrast to the chaotic grinding of the lower floors. I stepped out onto the plush carpet, feeling my worn shoes sink into the luxurious fabric. I swallowed hard, forcing my trembling legs to carry me forward into the heavily guarded sanctuary of the corporate elite. A stern executive assistant sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her sharp eyes scanning me with calculating judgment. She took in my faded clothes and damp hair, clearly wondering how someone like me had bypassed the strict security below. I softly spoke my name, my voice sounding fragile in the vast expanse of the quiet room. She did not offer a polite smile, simply pressing a silver button on her telephone to announce my arrival. A brief confirmation crackled through the speaker, granting me permission to proceed down the elegantly lit corridor. Walking down that plush hallway felt like taking irreversible steps toward a beautiful, inevitable ruin. The walls were adorned with abstract art that silently projected an aura of immense, untouchable wealth. I stopped in front of the towering mahogany double doors, my hand shaking as I reached for the metal handles. This solid barrier was designed to keep the ordinary, struggling world separated from the ruler inside. I took one last breath of the freezing air before pushing the heavy wood open and stepping over the threshold. The corner office was vast, featuring panoramic windows that offered a dizzying view of the weeping city. Victoria was standing perfectly still behind her imposing desk, reviewing a document with a cold, detached posture. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, she looked every inch the ruthless executive my husband feared so deeply. For a fleeting second, looking at her impenetrable mask, Genuine panic gripped my aching chest. I wondered if the vulnerable woman I had fallen for was merely an impossible illusion I had fabricated. I stepped fully into the magnificent room, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind my rigid body. The solid wood clicked smoothly into the frame, the automatic lock engaging with a definitive thud that echoed in the silence. That single noise instantly severed our connection to the judging corporate world waiting out in the hallway. We were completely isolated from the prying eyes and rigid expectations of the people working below us. The very moment the lock engaged, the suffocating atmosphere in the sprawling office shifted violently. Victoria dropped the document onto her polished desk, her rigid corporate posture melting away in a fraction of a second. The icy armor she wore for the public caught fire and burned down to the ground. Her terrifying mask vanished, replaced by a gaze so raw and hungry that it made my breath catch in my throat. She rounded the large desk with quick steps, closing the vast distance between us before I could process the movement. The freezing corporate air conditioning biting at my damp skin was forgotten, chased away by the radiant heat of her approach. She did not say a single word as she reached me, her hands reaching out to cup my face with desperate tenderness. The sophisticated scent of her woody perfume washed over me, acting as an intoxicating anchor in the middle of the storm. Looking up into her beautiful eyes, I saw absolutely none of the powerful executive. I only saw a woman starving for genuine connection. I leaned into her touch with a shuddering sigh, feeling the chilling city cold replaced by her overwhelming protective warmth. In her arms, surrounded by millions of dollars of corporate power, I had finally found my perfect safe haven. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the Seattle rain against the panoramic windows. I stood still in her embrace, terrified that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality we had just built. Victoria held me with a fierce protectiveness, her hands tracing slow circles on the damp fabric of my cheap jacket. The glaring contrast between her tailored suit and my humble uniform was a harsh reminder of the different worlds we inhabited. Yet, wrapped securely in her arms, those societal barriers dissolved, leaving only two women seeking solace in a cold world. She pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, her expression softening into pure adoration. Her thumb brushed across my cheekbone, a tender gesture that sent a cascade of warmth down to my chest. Without breaking our gaze, she took my trembling hand and intertwined our fingers with effortless ease. She guided me toward the center of the vast office, leading me away from the heavy wooden door and the corporate reality. We walked toward a dark leather couch that sat elegantly against the backdrop of the weeping gray sky. I allowed myself to be guided, feeling a sense of surrender that terrified and liberated my soul at the same time. We sat together on the plush leather, the expensive material cool beneath the palms of my anxious hands. I instinctively tried to pull my fingers away, suddenly ashamed of my rough edges in the middle of her flawless world. My hands were calloused from years of scrubbing feet and handling harsh chemicals in the noisy salon. They were the worn tools of a suburban servant, unworthy of touching a woman who commanded a corporate empire. But Victoria did not let go. Instead, she tightened her grip with a reassuring firmness that demanded my attention. She stood up from the couch and, to my shock, lowered her body until her knees rested on the carpet. The most powerful executive in the city was kneeling right in front of me, ignoring the immaculate crease of her tailored trousers. I gasped, my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked down at the brilliant woman at my feet. It was a breathtaking inversion of power that shattered every rule of the society we lived in. She brought my rough hands to her face, closing her clear eyes as she pressed a lingering kiss to my knuckles. The touch of her warm mouth against my calloused skin felt like a sacred blessing, a soothing balm applied to my wounded pride. She slowly turned my hands over, pressing her lips to my palms and kissing the scars I always tried to hide. A hot tear escaped my eye and raced down my cheek, fueled by a level of validation I had never experienced before. No one had ever treated my exhaustion with such reverence, treating my daily struggle as if it were a badge of honor. Victoria looked up at me, her eyes shining with a fierce devotion that made my breath catch in my throat. In a low, velvety whisper, she told me that my hands were the most beautiful thing she had ever held. She said they were the brave hands of a survivor, hands that had worked tirelessly and still managed to offer kindness to others. Every word she spoke dismantled the heavy walls of insecurity my husband had spent 10 years building around my heart. The degrading insults I endured at home were erased by the majestic adoration radiating from the woman kneeling before me. I leaned forward, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the love she was freely pouring into my starving soul. My tears fell freely now, dropping onto the lapels of her expensive suit, but she did not seem to care. She reached up with one elegant hand to wipe the moisture from my face, her touch infinitely gentle against my flushed skin. I felt the scattered pieces of my bruised self-esteem slowly knitting back together under her careful attention. In the quiet sanctity of that locked office, I was no longer an invisible, betrayed wife. I was a cherished queen. I slid off the edge of the leather couch, dropping down onto the soft carpet to be on the exact same level as her. I wrapped my arms around her neck, burying my face in the crook of her shoulder and breathing in her intoxicating perfume. She embraced me with equal desperation, pulling my body flush against hers and anchoring me in the center of her protective universe. We held each other tightly on the floor of the executive penthouse, two weary travelers who had found their ultimate destination. The steady beating of her heart against my chest served as a soothing lullaby that calmed my frayed nerves. The heavy Seattle storm continued to rage outside the panoramic glass, but inside our private bubble, a profound peace had settled. Victoria pulled back just enough to frame my face with her hands, her thumbs tracing the delicate line of my jaw. Her gaze dropped from my tearful eyes to my lips, signaling a magnetic shift from tender comfort to undeniable desire. The air between us grew thick, crackling with a vibrant electricity that made my body hum with anticipation. I found myself leaning in instinctively, drawn to her warmth like a freezing woman inching closer to a blazing fire. When our lips finally met, it was a collision of starved souls finding their true source of nourishment. The kiss was achingly tender and slow, a deliberate exploration that tasted of sweet espresso and the salty trace of my recent tears. There was no aggressive demand or rush, only a deep worship that made my stomach flutter with 1,000 butterflies. I brought my hands up to tangle my fingers in her immaculate brown hair, ruining her perfect corporate bun without a single ounce of regret. She responded by deepening the kiss, her arms wrapping securely around my waist to pull me closer into her radiant heat. We lost ourselves in the quiet sanctity of that vast office, allowing the stolen minutes to slip away unnoticed. Every gentle caress and whispered word of affection was a building block, constructing a beautiful sanctuary where my wounded spirit could rest. The harsh reality of my fake marriage and her demanding corporate empire faded into a distant, irrelevant background noise. I felt cherished and deeply understood, wrapped in a cocoon of safety that was healing the deepest parts of my heart. We eventually pulled apart, resting our foreheads together as we tried to catch our breath in the emotionally charged silence of the room. Victoria smiled softly, her thumb brushing across my swollen lower lip in a lingering caress that sent a shiver down my spine. She whispered that she wished we could stay hidden in this locked room forever, shielded from the demanding world waiting below us. But the harsh truth was that my lunch hour was rapidly coming to an end, and the neighborhood salon was expecting my return. I had to put my faded armor back on and walk out into the rain, returning to a life that no longer fit my awakened soul. Yet, as I stood up to adjust my damp clothes, I knew with absolute certainty that the terrified, submissive Rachel was gone for good. The heavy glass doors of the towering corporate building slid shut behind my damp jacket, sealing away the magic of my stolen afternoon. I stepped back out onto the bustling, rain-soaked streets of Seattle, feeling a strange, vibrant heat radiating from deep within my core. My worn sneakers splashed carelessly through the cold puddles that usually made my commute feel like an endless chore. The deafening noise of city traffic washed over me, but it failed to drown out the lingering memory of her raspy voice. I walked toward the bus stop with a new rhythm in my step, completely indifferent to the storm raging above my head. The harsh chemical scent of acetone assaulted my senses the second I pushed through the glass door of the neighborhood salon. It was a jarring contrast to the sophisticated aroma of rich espresso and expensive woody perfume that still clung to my skin. The chaotic noise of humming hairdryers and gossiping voices usually gave me a throbbing headache that lasted well into the evening. Today, however, the mundane chatter simply bounced off the invisible armor that Victoria's adoration had built around my heart. I walked toward my small workstation with my spine perfectly straight, feeling disconnected from the drab reality of my daily life. Susan immediately stopped filing her client's nails, her calculating eyes scanning my flushed face with unmistakable suspicion. She narrowed her heavily drawn eyebrows, crossing her arms as she openly scrutinized my unusually serene demeanor. She let out a bitter laugh, demanding to know what had taken me so long during a simple lunch break. I offered a polite, non-committal smile, keeping my eyes fixed on my white towels as I slowly organized my metal tools. Her malicious, invasive questions were powerless against the monumental secret I was hiding beneath my faded smock. My peaceful bubble was abruptly interrupted when a notoriously difficult, wealthy woman from the upscale side of town stormed into the salon. She wore a dripping designer raincoat and carried a furious expression, clearly enraged that the sudden downpour had ruined her shopping trip. She marched directly toward my empty chair, dropping her heavy leather handbag onto the floor with an obnoxious thud. Without waiting for a greeting, she sharply ordered me to fix a chipped nail immediately, speaking to me as if I were an incompetent servant. The entire salon fell into a tense silence, waiting for me to lower my head and apologize like I always did. The old version of myself would have stumbled over my words, begging for her patience while frantically searching for the correct polish color. I would have let her condescending tone shrink me down until I felt completely worthless in front of my peers. But the terrified, obedient woman who used to occupy this plastic chair had died a quiet death on the floor of the executive penthouse. I thought of Victoria's unyielding authority, remembering the way she had handled my abusive husband with effortless corporate grace. A sudden wave of absolute confidence washed over my weary soul, straightening my posture and erasing any lingering traces of my former cowardice. I did not flinch, I did not apologize, and I certainly did not rush to obey her barking commands like a frightened dog. Instead, I slowly picked up a clean white towel, folding it with deliberate precision while maintaining a calm, impenetrable expression. I looked directly into the arrogant woman's angry eyes, holding her gaze with a freezing intensity that made her blink in sudden confusion. I spoke with a low, perfectly steady voice, informing her that my schedule was full and that she would have to wait her turn. The icy professionalism in my tone left no room for negotiation, argument, or further disrespectful tantrums. The wealthy client gasped, her jaw dropping slightly as she struggled to comprehend the polite defiance coming from a lowly manicurist. She opened her mouth to unleash a fresh torrent of insults, preparing to demand the presence of the terrified salon owner. But I simply tilted my head to the side, mirroring the intimidating posture Victoria used when assessing a corporate liability. I softly added that a lack of basic manners would not expedite the service, and that she was free to find another establishment if she preferred. My words hung heavily in the tense air, striking with the lethal precision of a silent assassin. The audacity of my calm response short-circuited the woman's entitled brain, leaving her entirely speechless and visibly uncomfortable. She looked around the quiet room for support, but found only wide, shocked eyes staring back at her unfolding humiliation. Realizing she had lost the power dynamic, she huffed in defeated frustration and practically threw herself into the plastic waiting chair. She crossed her arms defensively, her face burning with a bright red flush of embarrassment as she stared furiously at the damp floor. It was a spectacular, quiet victory that validated the newfound strength coursing through my previously weary veins. I turned back to my workstation, a triumphant smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. I could feel Susan's eyes burning holes into the side of my head, her mouth hanging open in a comical display of shock. The coworker who thrived on my misery was now watching me command respect with a grace she could never possess. She fumbled with her nail file, too stunned to offer a single sarcastic comment. The absolute silence from her station was the sweetest music I had heard in my entire decade of working there. As I prepared a warm bowl of soapy water for my next appointment, a realization pierced my mind. The power I had just wielded did not come from the expensive suit or the billions of dollars in Victoria's bank account. It came from the certainty that I was valued, truly seen, and protected by someone who mattered. The chains of my chronic insecurity had finally snapped, leaving behind a fierce warrior who refused to be stepped on ever again. I was no longer a victim, but the confident author of my own narrative. My hands, which used to tremble at the slightest hint of conflict, were now perfectly steady. I smoothed down the wrinkled fabric of my faded smock, treating the cheap uniform as if it were a suit of armor. Every breath I took filled my lungs with a fresh energy that banished the stale atmosphere of the salon. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the smudged mirror, marveling at the defiant woman staring back at me. Seattle continued to mourn outside the foggy window, but a brilliant sun had finally risen inside my chest. The afternoon resumed its chaotic pace, the humming hair dryers roaring back to life as the tense atmosphere dissipated. Yet, a new respect lingered in the damp air, shifting the social dynamic of the gossipy workplace in my favor. I worked with a serene focus, unaware that this personal triumph was merely the opening act of a darker drama. A simple trip to the employee break room for a glass of water was about to shatter the remaining illusions of my marriage. The devastating truth about my husband's betrayal was waiting for me in the shadows, ready to trigger the final avalanche. The lingering adrenaline from my confrontation with the wealthy client left my throat feeling dry. I quietly excused myself from my workstation, needing a brief moment of silence away from the humming hair dryers. The narrow hallway leading to the cramped break room was dimly lit and smelled faintly of burnt coffee. I walked with slow steps, my mind still wrapped in the protective warmth of Victoria's devotion. A sudden sound of a hushed, frantic voice echoing from the kitchen area made me freeze in my tracks. The wooden door to the break room was left slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of fluorescent light to escape. I pressed my back against the peeling wallpaper of the hallway, instinctively holding my breath. The shrill voice belonged to Susan, but her usual mocking tone was missing from the intense conversation. She sounded desperate, whining into her phone with a frantic energy that caught my attention. My curiosity overrode my polite manners, forcing me to remain still and listen. Susan paced back and forth across the cracked linoleum floor, her acrylic nails tapping furiously against the back of her phone. She demanded to know why he had canceled their plans the night before, complaining about feeling neglected. Her voice cracked with a toxic desperation, revealing a deeply insecure woman begging for crumbs of attention. I rolled my eyes silently, feeling a brief moment of pity for my bitter coworker. But that mild sympathy evaporated the second she mentioned a highly specific detail about her secret lover. She loudly complained that she had waited for hours in the pouring Seattle rain, wearing that disgustingly sweet perfume he supposedly loved so much. A violent chill ran straight down my spine, freezing the warm blood in my veins. That exact nauseating floral scent was the ghost that clung stubbornly to my husband's motorcycle jacket every weekend. My mind tried to reject the horrifying connection forming rapidly in the dark corners of my brain. I leaned closer to the narrow crack in the door, my trembling hands clutching the fabric of my smock. Susan let out a frustrated sigh, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper that cut through the quiet room. She angrily reminded the man on the phone that her rent was overdue and that he had promised to help her pay it. She scoffed, mocking him for using a fabricated excuse about a broken plumbing pipe to avoid seeing her the previous afternoon. The heavy weight of an anvil dropped directly into my stomach, knocking the breath out of my lungs. The specific lie about the plumbing emergency was the exact same story Roger had stammered to Victoria on our front sidewalk. The scattered puzzle pieces of my reality violently slammed together, forming a crystal-clear picture of betrayal. My venomous coworker, The woman who constantly mocked my faded clothes and questioned my marital happiness was sleeping with my husband. The sheer hypocrisy of her daily taunts echoed in my ears, making my skin crawl with profound disgust. She had been secretly stealing my broken life while simultaneously mocking me for enduring the chains of my marriage. A sickening wave of nausea washed over my shaking body, forcing me to press my hand tightly over my mouth. My silent epiphany was definitively confirmed when Susan lost her fragile temper and screamed his name into the receiver. She told Roger that he was a coward, furiously threatening to show up at the manufacturing plant if he ignored her calls again. Hearing my husband's name fall from her deceitful lips felt like a sharp dagger plunging directly into my chest. The world around me stopped spinning, leaving me trapped in a suspended vacuum of devastating shock and absolute clarity. The man who controlled my finances and demanded my blind obedience was spending our meager savings on the most hateful woman in the salon. I expected to feel the agonizing sting of a broken heart, the suffocating sorrow of a devoted wife discovering a tragic affair. Instead, a strange numbness began to spread rapidly from my core, extinguishing any lingering remnants of my marital loyalty. The profound revulsion I felt was not born from a place of shattered love, but rather from a place of deep intellectual insult. They were two cowardly creatures sneaking around in the dark, believing they were outsmarting the quiet woman scrubbing feet for a living. Their cheap little secret was nothing compared to the majestic empire of devotion I was currently building in the executive penthouse. I remembered all the invasive questions Susan had asked me over the years, pretending to be a concerned friend during my darkest days. She had fished for private details about my domestic struggles, using my vulnerable tears to fuel her sick ego. She thrived on the knowledge that she was the other woman, secretly holding the imaginary upper hand in our daily interactions. The anger that suddenly ignited in my veins was not a screaming rage, but a cold, highly focused, and lethal precision. I was standing in the shadows of a dirty hallway, but my awakened spirit was ready to burn their miserable kingdom to the ground. Susan abruptly ended the phone call with a string of hushed curses, shoving her phone deep into her uniform pocket. I heard her angry footsteps marching toward the wooden door, signaling the end of her secret breakdown. I quickly pressed my back flat against the peeling wallpaper, sliding quietly into the dark alcove next to the water cooler. I held my breath until my lungs burned, praying that my pounding heart would not betray my hidden presence. The heavy door swung open forcefully, allowing a wide beam of harsh fluorescent light to flood the dim corridor. She marched past my hiding spot without casting a single glance in my direction, completely absorbed in her own furious thoughts. As she walked by, the nauseating scent of that sweet perfume trailed heavily behind her like a toxic cloud. That lingering aroma was the final physical proof I needed to sever the rusted chains of my old life. I watched her retreating back until she disappeared onto the noisy salon floor, returning to her fake persona as if nothing had happened. The immediate danger of discovery had passed, leaving me alone in the quiet hallway with the most powerful weapon in the world. I finally stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly into the empty break room, locking the wooden door securely behind me. I walked straight to the small stained sink and turned on the cold water faucet, letting the freezing liquid rush over my trembling hands. I splashed the icy water onto my flushed face, washing away the lingering shock and staring directly into the cracked mirror above the basin. I did not shed a single tear for the sudden death of my 10-year marriage to a manipulative man. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile spread across my wet face, illuminating the dark, unstoppable vengeance that had just awakened inside my soul. I stood frozen before the cracked mirror, watching the cold water drip slowly from my pale chin. Society dictated that a betrayed wife should be completely falling apart, sobbing hysterically in absolute despair. I was supposed to be mourning the sudden death of my 10-year marriage. Yet, as I stared into my own eyes, the suffocating weight I expected to feel was entirely absent from my chest. Instead of an agonizing heartbreak, a profound and intoxicating wave of pure relief began to wash over my trembling body. For the past few days, A dark guilt had been quietly eating away at the fragile edges of my newly awakened soul. I had agonized endlessly over my forbidden feelings for the magnificent woman who had treated me like a precious queen. My traditional upbringing had constantly whispered that I was committing an unforgivable sin by seeking comfort outside my miserable home. But discovering his dirty affair with the most venomous woman in my daily life completely severed those invisible chains of morality. His profound hypocrisy was the ultimate absolution my battered conscience desperately needed to fully embrace my secret romance. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly against the damp walls of the cramped washroom. The pathetic absurdity of their secret relationship was a tragicomic masterpiece of profound mediocrity and selfish ego. He had traded the quiet devotion of his wife for the loud, toxic validation of a woman who complained about overdue rent. They truly deserved each other, two cowardly souls swimming happily in the shallow puddle of their own insignificance. Their cheap betrayal paled entirely in comparison to the majestic empire of devotion I was quietly building in the executive Penthouse. I took a long, deep breath, realizing that the stale, chemical-filled air of the salon no longer felt suffocating. The invisible corset of anxiety that had restricted my weary lungs for a decade was finally discarded. I felt lighter than a stray feather caught in an upward breeze, floating effortlessly above the pathetic drama of my former existence. The paralyzing fear of displeasing my husband evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a fierce, unyielding warrior ready for battle. I was no longer a victim trapped in a loveless marriage, but a brilliant strategist holding the winning hand. I slowly lowered my gaze to my wet, calloused hands, resting on the porcelain edge of the bathroom sink. My eyes locked onto the thin gold band tightly encircling my left ring finger, a physical reminder of my domestic prison. Roger had bought that inexpensive piece of metal 10 years ago, claiming it was a symbol of his unwavering protection. In reality, it had functioned merely as a restrictive collar, a branding mark signaling to the world that I was his property. The metal suddenly felt scorching hot against my pale skin, a toxic parasite that I desperately needed to extract. I reached over with my right hand, grasping the cold metal with a steady, calculated determination. I twisted the golden band firmly, pulling it upward over my knuckle. But the stubborn ring initially resisted my forceful movement. It was as if the wasted decade of my youth was physically fighting to maintain its cruel grip on my life. I applied a little more pressure, ignoring the slight pain as the metal scraped against my wet skin. With one final, decisive pull, the ring slid entirely off my finger, leaving behind a pale, ghostly indentation where my submission used to live. I held the tiny, insignificant circle of gold between my thumb and index finger, marveling at how light and cheap it felt. This pathetic object had successfully commanded my absolute obedience and fueled my deepest terrors for my entire adult life. I had washed his clothes, cooked his meals, and swallowed his insults, all to honor the empty promise of this metal. Looking at it now, stripped of its false power, I saw only a useless trinket that belonged to a weak, foolish girl. That frightened girl was dead and buried, violently replaced by a woman who belonged exclusively to a magnificent queen. I turned slowly toward the overflowing plastic trash can, sitting neglected in the dark corner of the bathroom. Without a single ounce of hesitation or a fleeting moment of regret, I opened my hand and let it fall. The cheap gold band hit the bottom of the plastic bin with a dull, anticlimactic thud that echoed softly in the quiet room. That unimpressive noise was the official soundtrack marking the absolute end of my toxic relationship with my cheating husband. There were no grand orchestral violins or dramatic screaming fights. There was only the quiet, beautiful sound of garbage joining the garbage. I immediately turned the cold water faucet back on, pushing my bare hands under the rushing stream in a silent baptism. I grabbed the harsh institutional soap and vigorously scrubbed my fingers, desperately wanting to wash away the last traces of his existence. The thick white lather carried away the imaginary dirt of his betrayal, cleansing my bruised soul of his toxic influence. I rinsed my hands thoroughly, watching the soapy water spiral rapidly down the rusted drain, taking my heavy past along with it. When I finally turned the faucet off, the profound silence in the tiny bathroom felt incredibly holy, pregnant with a vibrant future. I pulled a rough paper towel from the rusted metal dispenser, drying my clean hands with slow, methodical precision. I lifted my head to meet my own gaze in the cracked mirror one final time, completely stunned by the breathtaking transformation. The weary, faded woman who had walked into this salon earlier this morning was entirely unrecognizable, replaced by a radiant, fierce stranger. My cheeks were flushed with a victorious color, and my clear eyes sparkled with the dangerous, intoxicating thrill of absolute freedom. I had officially crossed the irreversible line into a brand new universe, leaving my cowardice burning quietly in the ashes behind me. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my faded smock, adjusting the collar with the dignified, untouchable grace of a newly crowned monarch. I knew I still had to walk back out onto the noisy salon floor and face the miserable woman who was currently sleeping with my husband. But she held absolutely no power over me anymore, unaware that her pathetic secret had actually handed me the ultimate victory. I was not going to scream, cry, or cause a vulgar scene in the middle of our cramped workplace. I was going to serve my vengeance completely ice cold, walking away from their filthy mess with my head held incredibly high. I reached out and firmly grasped the cold metal doorknob of the bathroom, feeling a thrilling, electric surge of pure power. The woman stepping out of this cramped space was entirely fearless, armed with a devastating secret that completely altered her destiny. Victoria had graciously handed me the heavy silver key to my ultimate salvation, but I had finally found the immense courage to turn the lock myself. I swung the wooden door open, letting the harsh fluorescent light wash over my perfectly calm, smiling face. It was time to pack up my simple tools, deliver one final message to the Mistress, and walk out into the Seattle rain forever. I stepped out of the cramped bathroom and walked back onto the noisy, brightly lit salon floor with a light, steady stride. The chaotic symphony of humming hair dryers and gossiping voices washed over me, but it no longer felt like a suffocating trap. I navigated the narrow aisles between the plastic chairs, feeling like an entirely different species evolving right in the middle of a stagnant pond. My eyes immediately locked onto Susan, who was aggressively buffing a client's acrylic nails with her usual scowl of bitter dissatisfaction. She looked incredibly small and pathetic to me now, completely stripped of the menacing power she had held over my daily life. I reached my workstation and stood behind the cheap plastic chair, taking a long, deep breath of the harsh, chemical-filled air. I did not sit down to wait for my next scheduled appointment, refusing to ever again occupy the submissive space I had outgrown. Instead, I slowly reached under the Formica counter and pulled out my worn faux leather purse, placing it firmly on the sterile tabletop. The soft, satisfying clink of the metal hardware against the hard surface sounded like the definitive ringing of a heavy closing bell. I was officially clocking out of this toxic existence, preparing to abandon the only meager professional security I had ever truly known. I unzipped the main compartment of my bag, moving with a calm, unapologetic precision that immediately caught the attention of my peers. I opened the sterile pouches containing my metal clippers and files, carefully transferring the cold tools into the dark depths of my purse. I did not rush my packing process, savoring every single movement as a methodical dismantling of the chains that bound my spirit. The delicate rose gold chain Victoria had given me rested warmly against my collarbone, a hidden talisman pulsing with protective energy. Every metal tool dropping into the dark bag was a solid brick removed from the high walls of my suburban prison. Susan stopped her aggressive buffing, her calculating eyes darting toward my station as she noticed my highly unusual midday packing routine. She dropped her abrasive file onto her cluttered table with a loud, obnoxious thud, crossing her arms defensively over her faded uniform smock. She loudly demanded to know exactly what I thought I was doing, reminding me in a harsh tone that my shift was not over. The entire salon seemed to hold its collective breath, the ambient chatter dying down as curious eyes locked onto our unfolding confrontation. They were eagerly anticipating my usual pathetic apology, fully expecting the timid manicurist to immediately cower and beg for forgiveness. I did not even bother to look up from my worn purse, completely ignoring her shrill, demanding question with a freezing wall of silence. The blood drained entirely from Susan's face, transforming her cruel, mocking features into a chalky, pale mask of undeniable horror and deep confusion. She realized in a fraction of a second that her dirty affair was completely exposed, and her imaginary upper hand was entirely destroyed. Her hands began to tremble violently, knocking a small bottle of cheap polish off her table and sending it crashing loudly onto the ceramic tiles. She opened her mouth to stammer a desperate lie, but the sheer shock of my cold, collected delivery had entirely paralyzed her vocal cords. I simply picked up my heavy faux leather purse, slinging the long strap over my shoulder with an effortless, triumphant grace. I turned my back on the cramped, toxic neighborhood salon for the very last time, walking slowly and deliberately toward the glass storefront doors. I pushed the heavy glass open, stepping out into the cold, weeping Seattle rain, without casting a single backward glance at my former prison. I was a free, powerful woman, walking away from the miserable ashes of my past, marching directly toward the brilliant empire waiting for me. The walk back to my damp suburban house felt different this time, devoid of the usual suffocating dread. The Seattle rain battered my umbrella, but the freezing wind could not penetrate the heat expanding in my chest. I navigated the familiar streets with the determined stride of a woman walking toward her ultimate salvation. Every puddle I stepped over felt like an insignificant obstacle on my journey to a new universe. I was leaving the bitter ashes of my past behind to embrace the queen waiting for me. I pushed the rusted front door open and stepped into the dim living room for the last time. The oppressive silence that used to crush my spirit now felt like a welcoming blank canvas. I did not waste a second lingering in the hallway or mourning the fake memories scattered around. I walked purposefully toward the bedroom, my mind consumed by the intoxicating memory of Victoria's voice. The magnetic pull of her devotion guided my hurried steps, urging me to quickly shed my old skin. I reached into the back of the dusty closet and pulled down a small travel bag with a broken zipper. Placing the empty canvas bag on the lumpy mattress, I stared at my humble clothes. The drab garments hanging limply on the wire racks looked foreign, as if they belonged to a different person. They were the sad costumes of a submissive woman who had forgotten how to shine. I realized with striking clarity that I could not take this depressing baggage into my passionate future. I grabbed a faded floral dress that had always made me feel invisible and inadequate. It was a garment tied to a past where my desires were constantly silenced. Instead of folding it, I casually dropped the ugly fabric onto the bed like a discarded rag. Leaving that dress behind was a powerful declaration of my independence and newfound self-worth. I was officially resigning from my tragic role and stepping boldly into the spotlight of a genuine romance. My hands bypassed the rough cotton shirts and immediately sought the hidden treasure tucked away in my bottom drawer. My fingers brushed against the soft black silk of the delicate lingerie Victoria had slipped into my purse. A delightful shiver ran down my spine as the sheer fabric slid across my sensitive skin. Touching the lace transported my mind back to the safe warmth of her executive office. The vivid memory of her adoring eyes sweeping over my body made my breathing grow shallow. I lifted the black silk piece and brought it up to my face, closing my eyes in pure bliss. The sophisticated scent of her signature perfume was still woven into the fine threads, acting as a romantic anchor. Breathing in her aroma erased any lingering doubts trying to sneak into my racing mind. I carefully folded the luxurious garment, placing it at the bottom of my travel bag like a sacred relic. It was the only physical possession I truly needed to carry into our epic romance. I grabbed only a few bare essentials, tossing a clean toothbrush and a simple pair of jeans into the bag. I did not need to pack heavy coats or formal dresses, because the woman waiting for me possessed an empire. Victoria had promised to rebuild my world, offering an elevated kingdom built on mutual respect. The paralyzing fear of poverty had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming tide of unconditional trust. I was surrendering my worldly burdens to accept the generous grace of her unwavering love. As I packed my makeup bag, my thoughts drifted to the reverent way she had kissed my calloused hands. No one had ever treated my exhausted body as a precious work of art, worthy of such silent worship. The undeniable contrast between my miserable past and the consuming fire of our secret connection was staggering. I was finally choosing to be cherished, held securely by a woman who saw my brilliant soul. Her protective arms were the only true home I ever wanted to occupy. I pulled the metal zipper of the travel bag closed, the defining sound echoing loudly in the quiet bedroom. The physical weight of the bag was incredibly light, matching the sudden buoyancy expanding inside my chest. I was leaving almost everything behind, yet I had never felt so wealthy and complete. The rusted chains of obligation were severed, leaving a free spirit intoxicated by a forbidden romance. I gripped the canvas handles, feeling a massive wave of reckless courage flood my reawakened nervous system. I turned to face the cracked mirror leaning against the damp wall, taking one final look at my reflection. The frightened manicurist who used to cry in the shadows was gone, replaced by a fierce lover. My cheeks were flushed with a victorious color, and my eyes sparkled with the thrilling promise of an illicit affair. I ran a steady hand through my blonde hair, marveling at the unyielding confidence radiating from my liberated soul. I was a woman desperately in love, and that majestic emotion made me invincible. A vivid daydream briefly captured my attention, painting a breathtaking picture of the glorious morning waiting for me. I imagined waking up slowly in her downtown penthouse, tangled happily in cool white sheets and her protective embrace. I pictured her clear eyes looking at me with that raw hunger, before leaning in for a soft kiss. The agonizing loneliness of my previous decade was officially over, conquered by the most enchanting woman in the city. I smiled a genuine smile, letting the romantic anticipation override any sudden fear. I turned my back on the cracked mirror and walked out of the depressing bedroom without a single backward glance. I carried my light travel bag down the narrow hallway, stepping confidently into the dim living room for the final time. The weeping Seattle storm continued to batter the thin windows, but the tempest matched my passionate heart. I was ready to sever the final tie to this miserable house and walk freely into her waiting arms. The grand climax of my unlikely story was finally here, and I was going to claim it. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, gripping the canvas handles of my bag. The rusted hinges of the front door squeaked loudly, announcing the sudden arrival of the man I used to fear. Roger stepped into the damp house, shaking the heavy rain from his thick coat like a miserable dog. He carried his usual aura of toxic arrogance, unaware that his fragile kingdom had already burned to ash. I watched him wipe his muddy boots on the frayed mat, feeling absolutely nothing but a sweeping peace. He lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto my packed bag and my straight, confident posture. A fleeting flash of confusion crossed his rough face before he attempted to puff out his chest. He harshly demanded to know where I thought I was going on such a stormy evening. The loud tone that used to make me cower now sounded incredibly weak and utterly ridiculous. I did not shrink away from his anger, holding his gaze with a calculated indifference that made him falter. I did not raise my voice to match his chaotic energy, choosing instead to channel Victoria's untouchable grace. I spoke in a low, steady whisper, informing him that his pathetic game of deception was over. I casually mentioned the cloying floral perfume that constantly clung to his motorcycle jacket. I then added the specific, ridiculous excuse about the broken plumbing pipe he had nervously stammered to my protector. The precise delivery of his own dirty lies hung heavily in the tense air, striking him like a physical blow. The angry color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a chalky mask of pure terror. His dominant alpha male facade shattered instantly into a million cowardly pieces right before my eyes. He realized in a fraction of a second that I knew everything about his cheap affair with Susan. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to formulate a single coherent defense that simply did not exist. The man who had controlled my entire adult life was suddenly reduced to a stammering shadow of a human. I smoothly raised my hand to cut off his desperate attempts to pollute my air with more lies. I informed him that his miserable mistress had been loudly complaining about his cowardice in the salon break room. I stated clearly that they deserved their toxic life together, wallowing happily in their own spectacular mediocrity. The profound romance waiting for me in the executive penthouse was untouchable by his insignificant betrayals. I was elevating my awakened soul far above his muddy puddle, stepping boldly into a brand new universe. His knees buckled slightly under the crushing weight of his complete exposure and sudden loss of domestic control. He was terrified, not of losing my devotion, but of the catastrophic professional consequences hovering over his head. He knew that the powerful billionaire woman who cherished me held his unremarkable logistics career in her hands. He weakly begged me not to destroy his life, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation that sickened me. I looked down at his trembling, hunched figure, marveling at how small and insignificant he had always been. A genuine smile spread across my flushed face, illuminating the dark shadows of the suburban living room. My wild heart was already miles away from this damp prison, sitting happily in the luxurious downtown penthouse. I was fiercely loved by a woman who worshipped my calloused hands and treated my soul like a precious treasure. His cowardly begging was merely background noise, drowned out by the vivid memory of her raspy voice. I was a radiant queen preparing to leave a ruined castle to rightfully claim my elevated throne. I softly told him that his sad career and his cheap affair were the absolute least of my concerns. I was walking away to embrace a sweeping romance built on a solid foundation of burning respect. I reached into the pocket of my faded jeans, pulling out the cold brass key to the front door. I casually dropped the small metal object onto the scratched surface of the worn wooden coffee table. The sharp clink sounded like the definitive period placed at the very end of our tragic sentence. He took a desperate step forward, raising his shaking hand in a final attempt to grab my arm. I stepped back with an effortless, fluid grace, moving entirely out of his toxic reach and remaining beautifully untouchable. An invisible shield forged from Victoria's unwavering devotion protected my fragile body from his aggressive grasp. He dropped his arm heavily to his side, defeated by the quiet power coursing through my veins. The oppressive grip he had maintained on my spirit for a decade was permanently broken. I turned my back on his defeated figure, walking purposefully toward the wooden door with measured steps. The stale air of the dim living room immediately lifted, replaced by the fresh, damp breeze outside. I grasped the cold brass handle, feeling a massive wave of pure courage flooding my reawakened nervous system. I pulled the heavy door open, revealing the dark, weeping city street that now looked like a promising pathway. I was stepping boldly into the raging storm, leaving my cowardice burning quietly in the ashes. I stepped out onto the wet, cracked concrete porch. The freezing Seattle rain felt like a holy, cleansing baptism, washing over my flushed cheeks and erasing the last traces of the beaten suburban wife. I pulled the heavy door shut behind my back, the solid thud echoing loudly into the stormy night. The dark chapter of my domestic life officially closed forever, making way for a passionate, brilliant future. I took a deep breath of the damp city air, tasting the sweet nectar of absolute liberty. The chaotic noise of the city storm raged fiercely all around my exposed body. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated deeply inside the damp pocket of my thin jacket. The frantic buzzing cut sharply through the rhythmic drumming of the relentless rainfall. I stopped walking immediately, reaching for the glowing device with trembling, eager fingers. The bright screen illuminated the dark night with a beautiful, familiar name. Victoria was calling me exactly when I needed her fierce, protective presence the most. I quickly swiped the screen to answer, bringing the cold phone up to my wet ear. The deafening noise of the Seattle traffic faded into a distant background. A profound, velvety silence from the other end of the line wrapped warmly around my shivering shoulders. Then, Victoria spoke my name with a deep, raspy tenderness that melted my racing heart. That single, beautifully spoken word felt like a comforting blanket thrown securely over my fragile frame. She asked where I was, her voice laced with a fierce, protective urgency. I explained softly that I had finally left the depressing suburban prison for good. I confessed that I was standing alone on a dark, rainy sidewalk with a small bag. A heavy, emotionally charged silence hung on the line for a brief, breathless moment. Victoria let out a soft, shuddering sigh of pure relief and overwhelming admiration. She praised my immense courage, deeply validating the terrifying leap of faith I had just taken. She spoke with a majestic certainty that anchored my soul in the turbulent storm. The brilliant executive told me that I would never have to walk alone in the dark again. Every spoken syllable was a sacred vow of eternal devotion and complete physical safety. I closed my eyes, letting the beautiful promises wash over my exhausted spirit. Victoria commanded me to stay exactly where I was standing under the glowing street lamp. She stated firmly that her private driver was already navigating the flooded city streets. A sleek, armored luxury car was actively hunting for my exact location in the rainy night. The stark contrast between my current physical vulnerability and her massive corporate power was staggering. I agreed softly, feeling a profound, intoxicating surrender to the magnificent woman I loved so deeply. The phone call ended, leaving me feeling entirely accompanied and fiercely guarded. The minutes stretched beautifully as I watched the distant headlights pierce the thick, weeping city fog. Finally, a massive, familiar black vehicle turned the corner and glided smoothly down the flooded street. It pulled up slowly to the curb right beside me. The driver stepped out quickly, holding a massive black umbrella to shield me from the storm. He opened the heavy rear door, offering a respectful greeting that I returned with a brilliant smile. I stepped out of the freezing rain and slid happily into the warm, plush leather interior. The dreary suburban nightmare was instantly replaced by the sophisticated scent of fresh lilies and wealth. The heavy door closed with a definitive thud, sealing me safely inside a beautiful new reality. I sank back into the soft seat, letting out a long sigh of ultimate relief. The luxury car smoothly accelerated, leaving the cracked sidewalks and painful memories far behind in the dust. I looked out the tinted window, watching the miserable neighborhood blur into forgotten shadows. I was traveling rapidly toward the glowing skyline of the city, and the woman I adored. The painful leap into the unknown had miraculously landed me directly in a safe paradise. My epic romance was officially beginning, and I was entirely ready to be loved. The smooth, silent ride ended deep within the secure underground garage of the towering downtown skyscraper. The private elevator carried me upward with a dizzying speed that left my stomach fluttering with anticipation. When the metallic doors glided open, I stepped directly into the magnificent space of her private penthouse. The breathtaking panoramic view of the illuminated city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the massive glass windows. I stood frozen in the grand foyer, clutching my small travel bag with trembling fingers. Victoria emerged softly from the shadows of the dimly lit hallway, wearing a flowing white silk robe. She looked ethereal and deeply radiant, stripped of her intimidating corporate armor for the night. Her bare feet padded silently across the polished hardwood floor as she closed the vast distance between us. She did not say a single word before wrapping her warm, protective arms tightly around my shivering frame. I buried my face deeply into the crook of her neck, inhaling her intoxicating woody perfume. The freezing chill of the relentless storm was instantly chased away by the blazing heat of her embrace. She took the cheap canvas bag from my tight grip, tossing it carelessly aside. Her hands gently framed my pale face, her thumbs wiping away a stray raindrop resting on my flushed cheek. She pressed a lingering kiss to my forehead, murmuring a sacred promise that I was finally safe. The agonizing weight of the previous decade evaporated into the warm, comforting atmosphere of her majestic home. She led me gently toward the spa-inspired master bathroom, insisting that I thaw my frozen bones. A deep soaking tub was already filled with steaming hot water and fragrant bath oils waiting for me. I shed my damp clothes with a profound sense of finality, leaving the beaten suburban wife on the floor. Immersing myself in the hot water felt like a physical rebirth into a glorious existence. Victoria sat quietly on the edge of the marble tub, softly washing my hair with an overwhelming reverence. After the deeply healing bath, she wrapped me tightly in a thick, soft robe that smelled entirely of her. We walked together into the expansive living room, settling comfortably onto a plush velvet sofa facing the city lights. I curled my legs underneath me, resting my head peacefully against her chest while she stroked my damp hair. The profound silence of the secure penthouse was a stark contrast to the chaotic misery of my past. I felt entirely cherished and fiercely protected, intoxicated by the sweeping romance we were finally free to explore. The emotionally charged atmosphere shifted slightly when Victoria reached carefully for a sleek leather folder resting on the glass coffee table. She placed the professional-looking portfolio gently onto my lap, her clear eyes shining with an unwavering determination. I looked down at the embossed leather, feeling a sudden wave of deeply rooted financial insecurity wash over me. I softly whispered that I did not want to be a purchased prize, a delicate bird kept safely in a golden cage. I desperately needed her to understand that my burning love could never be bought with flashy gifts. Victoria smiled a beautiful, incredibly tender smile, gently lifting my chin so I was forced to meet her piercing gaze. She spoke in a low, velvety whisper, assuring me that she had no desire to simply rescue a helpless victim. She explained that she wanted a fierce, equal partner, standing proudly by her side to conquer the corporate world. The brilliant executive declared that true love was about elevating the other person to their highest potential. She urged me to open the heavy leather folder, her raspy voice vibrating with a thrilling excitement. My trembling fingers slowly flipped the thick leather cover open, revealing crisp documents printed on heavy cream paper. I scanned the elegant text, my breath catching violently in my throat as my exhausted brain struggled to comprehend the words. It was a fully paid, exclusive enrollment for an elite executive business program at the most prestigious university in the state. Victoria had not purchased expensive jewelry to distract me from my lingering trauma. She had generously purchased the undeniable key to my intellectual liberation and my future professional empire. The sheer magnitude of her breathtaking investment in my dormant potential sent a violent shockwave through my soul. Hot tears of pure joy and profound gratitude spilled rapidly over my flushed cheeks and onto the crisp documents. For 10 miserable years, my cruel husband had systematically convinced me that I was inherently worthless. Now, the most powerful billionaire in the city was officially betting a massive fortune on my hidden intelligence. She saw a brilliant, capable mind trapped behind the calloused hands of an overworked manicurist waiting to bloom. I dropped the leather folder carelessly onto the soft sofa, throwing my arms passionately around her neck with fierce energy. I kissed her with a raw, hungry intensity, pouring every ounce of my overwhelming love into the embrace. She responded immediately, pulling my body flush against hers and crushing my lips with a deep, soulful worship. The kiss tasted of absolute redemption, a beautiful promise that we would build an unshakable dynasty together. My wild heart soared effortlessly, completely untethered from the rusted chains of my tragic past. When we finally pulled apart to catch our ragged breath, our foreheads rested gently together in the dim penthouse lighting. She whispered a fierce vow against my swollen lips, promising to mentor me through every single late-night study session. Victoria swore that she would stand proudly in the front row, cheering the loudest when I finally crossed the graduation stage. The unconditional respect anchoring her romantic devotion made my spirit feel incredibly tall and beautifully whole. I was no longer a frightened refugee. I was a radiant queen officially claiming my rightful place beside her. The raging Seattle storm eventually subsided into a quiet drizzle against the massive glass windows of our private sanctuary. We spent the rest of the dark night tangled happily together in the expensive white sheets, consumed by our romance. Every gentle caress and whispered promise solidified the indestructible foundation of our glorious life perfectly intertwined. The miserable shadows of my old suburban prison were permanently banished by the golden dawn breaking over the city. I drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep in her warm arms, ready to conquer the entire world the very next morning. The changing seasons outside the panoramic penthouse windows marked the swift passage of my brand new reality. The relentless gray rain of the early Seattle spring had slowly surrendered to the crisp, vibrant winds of autumn. My days were no longer spent scrubbing calloused feet in the harsh chemical fumes of the cramped beauty salon. Instead, my exhausted mind was consumed by complex financial models and advanced corporate strategies at the prestigious local university. I sat cross-legged on the thick living room rug, surrounded completely by towering stacks of intimidating academic textbooks. The transition from a quiet suburban wife to a fiercely driven executive student was incredibly beautiful, but brutally demanding. My brain constantly ached from absorbing dense academic theories that felt foreign to my previously restricted world. A small, persistent voice of residual insecurity occasionally whispered toxic doubts into the weary corners of my racing mind. I rubbed my burning, bloodshot eyes, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my sleek silver laptop. The digital clock indicated it was well past midnight, but my massive final assignment was unfinished. I let out a heavy, defeated sigh, feeling the crushing weight of academic pressure pushing against my tired shoulders. A sudden wave of imposter syndrome threatened to drown the radiant confidence I had carefully built up. I momentarily wondered if leaving my simple, predictable misery to chase this towering ambition had been a massive mistake. The complicated spreadsheet glaring back at me seemed like an impossible mountain designed specifically to mock my humble origins. I buried my face deeply in my trembling hands, fighting a sudden urge to simply close the laptop. The soft padding of bare feet against the polished hardwood floor gently broke the ringing midnight silence. I did not need to lift my heavy head to know that my magnificent protective queen had entered the room. The sophisticated scent of her signature perfume wrapped warmly around my tense frame like a thick, comforting blanket. She had spent the entire grueling day commanding her massive corporate empire, yet she still found the energy to seek me. The gentle rustle of her silk robe announced her incredibly graceful descent onto the plush rug right beside me. Victoria did not offer empty platitudes or gently suggest that I abandon my rigorous studies for the night. Instead, she placed a steaming porcelain mug of rich, dark espresso directly into my cold, hesitant hands. The bitter, warm aroma of the expensive coffee immediately cleared the thick fog clouding my overworked brain. She shifted her body closer, allowing her radiant heat to seep directly into my chilled, stiff side. Her steadfast presence was a glowing lighthouse guiding my exhausted ship safely through the dark academic storm. She reached out with one elegant, perfectly manicured hand, sweeping a loose strand of blonde hair behind my ear. Her cool fingertips lingered affectionately against my flushed cheek, tracing the dark circles of exhaustion mapping my pale skin. I leaned heavily into her reverent touch, feeling my tense muscles instantly melt under her profound devotion. The intimidating textbooks and complex financial models temporarily faded into a distant, blurry background noise. In the quiet sanctity of our illuminated sanctuary, the only thing that truly mattered was her fierce, adoring gaze. I softly confessed my lingering fears, whispering that I was terrified of completely failing her generous intellectual investment. I admitted that the heavy ghosts of my past were trying, desperately to convince me I was not smart enough. Victoria smiled an incredibly tender smile, her clear eyes shining with an unyielding certainty in my potential. She gently took the warm mug from my hands, placing it carefully onto the glass table before taking my face in her palms. She spoke in a low, velvety whisper, her raspy voice vibrating with a thrilling, contagious confidence. She firmly declared that she had never placed a blind, foolish bet in her entire successful corporate career. The powerful woman swore that she had clearly seen my radiant, undeniable brilliance long before I could see it myself. Victoria reminded me of the fierce resilience I had displayed while surviving a decade of suffocating domestic misery. She stated that the brilliant woman who had outsmarted a manipulative husband could easily conquer any challenging business strategy. Every spoken syllable was a sacred vow of eternal devotion that completely reconstructed my shattered self-esteem. She leaned in and captured my lips in a slow, exquisitely tender kiss that tasted of sweet espresso and absolute salvation. There was no desperate urgency, only a deep worship that made my weary spirit soar effortlessly into the stratosphere. I melted entirely into her warm, protective embrace, allowing the consuming tide of her affection to wash away my doubts. The kiss was a powerful romantic battery, recharging my drained soul with a vibrant, unstoppable energy. When we finally pulled apart to catch our breath, the intimidating spreadsheet no longer looked like an impossible mountain. Victoria did not return to the incredibly soft bed waiting in the dark master bedroom down the hallway. Instead, the brilliant executive pulled a thick textbook onto her lap, adjusting her reading glasses with sharp, elegant grace. She patiently guided me through the complex financial models, translating the confusing academic jargon into clear, easily digestible concepts. We spent the remaining quiet hours of the night working seamlessly together as a fiercely united, unstoppable team. Her brilliant analytical mind perfectly complemented my passionate creative drive, forging an unbreakable partnership built on profound mutual respect. The pale, beautiful light of a new dawn finally began to creep softly across the expansive glass windows of the penthouse. I pressed the final keystroke on my silver laptop, successfully completing the massive assignment with a triumphant, breathless sigh. I closed the sleek machine, feeling an incredible wave of pure, unadulterated pride wash entirely over my aching body. I had survived the grueling academic trial by fire, emerging completely victorious and infinitely stronger than I was yesterday. I turned my head to look at the magnificent woman sitting peacefully beside me in the soft morning light. Victoria had fallen asleep sitting completely upright, her head resting gently against the plush fabric of the dark sofa. I smiled a genuine, brilliant smile, gently removing the reading glasses from her delicate face and kissing her smooth forehead. I realized with a striking clarity that I was finally, completely ready to step out of the dark, protective shadows. The grueling months of late-night studying had successfully forged a confident, lethally sharp commercial manager out of a broken manicurist. The sweeping corporate gala was rapidly approaching, and I was entirely prepared to claim my rightful throne beside my queen. The sprawling ballroom of the Grand Hotel was completely transformed for the annual corporate integration gala. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden glow over the sea of elegantly dressed employees from every single department. I stepped through the heavy double doors, wearing a breathtaking emerald gown that perfectly hugged my newly confident posture. The terrified, faded manicurist who used to hide in the shadows was gone, replaced by a radiant, powerful executive. My heart beat with a steady, fierce rhythm, deeply anchored by the absolute certainty of my hard-earned worth. Victoria walked gracefully right beside me, looking like an absolute, untouchable goddess in a sharply tailored midnight blue velvet suit. The powerful director radiated a magnetic authority that instantly commanded the undivided attention of the entire crowded room. Our physical distance remained impeccably professional, yet an intense, crackling electricity constantly surged through the narrow space separating our bodies. Every subtle glance she cast in my direction was a heavy, intoxicating reminder of the passionate secret nights we shared. I held my head incredibly high, feeling profoundly proud to walk alongside the most awe-inspiring woman in the city. The elegant, mingling crowd instinctively parted like the Red Sea as we made our grand, unhurried entrance into the main hall. This specific end-of-year celebration uniquely combined the wealthy corporate executives with the hard-working staff from the manufacturing plant. The sheer magnitude of the lavish event would have easily terrified the old, fragile version of my broken spirit. Now, surrounded by the intoxicating woody scent of her signature perfume, I felt entirely invincible against the curious, judging eyes. We were the undisputed, radiant center of the universe, moving seamlessly together with a majestic, synchronized grace. My clear eyes casually swept across the noisy room, briefly landing on a highly predictable, pathetic sight. Roger and Susan were standing near the cheap buffet tables, desperately trying to flaunt their toxic new romantic relationship. They wore flashy, terribly fitted clothes, attempting to project an illusion of grand success to the surrounding factory workers. The man who used to terrorize my existence now looked incredibly small, completely stripped of his former aggressive dominance. His bitter mistress clung to his arm, oblivious to the massive, devastating avalanche rapidly approaching their fragile kingdom. The exact moment their wandering eyes finally registered my radiant, elevated presence was a priceless masterpiece of pure humiliation. Roger dropped his glass of cheap champagne, the crystal shattering loudly against the polished floor as his jaw hung entirely slack. Susan turned a sickly, ghostly shade of pale, her heavily painted eyes widening in sheer terror and profound disbelief. They stared at the stunning, powerful woman dressed in emerald silk, utterly paralyzed by the shocking reality of my spectacular ascent. Their tiny brains violently struggled to comprehend how the discarded, invisible wife had miraculously conquered the absolute highest peak. I did not grant them the precious gift of a single lingering glance or a triumphant, vindictive smirk. Instead, I simply turned my head and offered Victoria a brilliant, breathtaking smile filled with pure, sweeping adoration. The ultimate, most devastating punishment I could ever inflict upon my past tormentors was my absolute, freezing, and unbothered indifference. Their dirty, cheap little betrayal was completely irrelevant, entirely drowned out by the monumental empire of love I now possessed. I gracefully continued walking toward the front stage, leaving their shattered, pathetic egos burning quietly in the ashes of my wake. The excited murmurs of the crowded ballroom slowly faded into a respectful, expectant silence as Victoria approached the wooden podium. The brilliant, commanding woman adjusted the microphone with a smooth elegance, her piercing gaze sweeping across the vast audience. She delivered a powerful, inspiring speech about the bright future of the company, emphasizing the crucial importance of hidden, untapped potential. Every spoken word resonated with a deep, raspy authority that sent delightful, familiar shivers running straight down my spine. I watched her from the front row, my chest swelling with a profound, overwhelming pride that threatened to completely consume me. The highly anticipated climax of the evening arrived when she formally announced the leadership for the brand new commercial division. Victoria spoke my full name with a rich, velvety reverence that echoed loudly through the massive, listening ballroom. A roaring, thunderous wave of polite applause erupted around me as I stood up, smoothing the luxurious silk of my emerald gown. I walked up the short, carpeted steps to the brightly lit stage, feeling like a victorious queen ascending her rightful throne. The blinding, hot spotlights washed entirely over my smiling face, completely erasing the last lingering shadows of my tragic history. I took my place right beside the most powerful woman in the city, feeling the radiant heat of her physical proximity. She handed me a heavy crystal award plaque, her soft, warm fingers briefly brushing against mine in a secret electric caress. The subtle, private touch sent a violent spark of pure desire shooting directly through my reawakened nervous system. We stood shoulder to shoulder facing the massive crowd, projecting a unified, brilliant front of supreme professional excellence and quiet strength. The undeniable chemistry between us was a beautiful, invisible force field protecting our profound, sweeping romance. In that magnificent moment under the heavy spotlights, the vast sea of faces completely faded into a meaningless blur. I turned my head slightly, catching her clear, adoring eyes looking at me with an overwhelming, raw pride. The agonizing decades of my past misery were permanently conquered by the fierce, unwavering devotion she freely offered. We were two incredibly strong women who had successfully navigated a treacherous storm to find our perfect sanctuary. Our secret, passionate love story was a triumphant melody, vibrating silently above the chaotic noise of the corporate world. I stepped up to the microphone, delivering a brief, eloquent speech of gratitude that I had meticulously practiced for weeks. My voice was perfectly steady and rich, carrying the undeniable quiet authority of a woman who fully knew her immense worth. I did not look at the dark, forgotten corners where my cowardly ex-husband and his bitter mistress were quietly hiding. My entire focus remained locked onto the bright, expansive horizon of the incredible, majestic life I was building. Every single syllable I spoke was a testament to the beautiful, radical transformation fueled entirely by the healing power of genuine affection. The thunderous standing ovation that followed my final word was a glorious, deafening confirmation of my spectacular rebirth. I walked down the stage steps with Victoria right beside me, our hearts beating together in a perfect, joyful rhythm. The dreary suburban house and the smelling beauty salon were nothing but faded, powerless ghosts of a distant nightmare. I was a radiant, fierce commercial manager, deeply cherished by the most breathtaking woman in the universe. The terrifying leap into the unknown had miraculously landed me in a beautiful paradise, and my sweeping romantic epic had truly just begun. If your heart raced along with Rachel's beautiful transformation, and you loved seeing this sweeping romance triumph over toxicity, do not leave just yet. Stories of true, empowering Sapphic love are the beating heart of our channel, and your amazing support keeps them alive. If you want to listen to our brand new stories before anyone else in the world, become a VIP member right here on YouTube by clicking the join button. Your VIP status grants you exclusive early access to all our future videos and help us create more beautiful romances. Thank you so much for being part of this journey, and we will see you in the next video.